Hi, my name is Amy K. Watson, and I coach purpose-driven, socially responsible, soulful leaders to discover their destiny and own their power with humor, courage, and compassion, which is why I was so excited to discover a book entitled Awakening Compassion at Work: The Quiet Power That Elevates People and Organizations. And I'm being joined today by one of the book's authors, Monica Worline. Monica is a research scientist who has focused on innovation in organizations. Her co-author, Jane Dutton, is a co-founder of the Center for Positive Organizations. What a fruitful field. Monica, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm so pleased to be here.
Oh, I'm really excited to talk with you. And I'm wondering if you could just start out by describing for me how you became interested in the topic of innovation in organizations.
Sure. I was an undergraduate at Stanford University, and I graduated and entered into Silicon Valley pre-internet bubble number one. At a time when the internet itself was really just becoming a publicly viable institution. And people really didn't have internet browsers in their homes yet. The first browsers were going into public spaces like libraries and museums. And I worked in a number of startup organizations, including a very early internet startup. And that made me very curious about how an organization innovates and creates new products and new services to offer. We were working in a space where many times the engineers didn't even know if a problem could be solved or not because the internet was so new and so untried. And I was also curious about how people develop sustainable work lives when they're working that much at the edge of their capacity and they're really trying to solve the unsolvable problems.
Yeah, that was back when we get stories about those folks at Apple that were living at the office practically.
Yes, that's right. And they may still be doing so.
Right. So what's compassion got to do with it?
Well, I got so fascinated by this question around what creates a humanly sustainable, high-performing, innovative work environment, that's what motivated me to go to graduate school. Okay. I was really curious about what wise people and scholars and researchers could tell us about that question, because it wasn't intuitively obvious to me how to do it when I was living in it. And what I learned as I was asking that question in graduate school and talking with people in organizational psychology and sociology and organizational behavior and all these different fields was that we don't have a very good answer to that question about what makes a high-performing human organization that's simultaneously high innovation or high performance. And it's only in the last 10 or 15 years that lots of people have been asking that question from a research lens. So corresponding with the rise of positive psychology, which a lot of people have heard of now, is a set of assumptions through the whole social sciences about there's something different about studying how people or organizations go from underperforming or abnormal to normal or acceptable performance than to understand how they go from normal or acceptable performance to excellent performance, to hugely innovative, right?
So kind of the good to great.
The good to great. So in the wake of the thinking about books like Good to Great, a whole new set of research questions have popped up. And one subgroup of those questions that I've been particularly interested in is, how do things that people used to study as virtues in philosophy, right? Like sort of the Aristotelian virtues like compassion and courage. How do those actually contribute to the capacity of an organizational system to perform at its best? And it turns out that when you know this all the time from coaching leaders, and leaders know this intuitively from their experience. When you're pushing for really great performance, you're reaching for the edge of what is capable, you're also pushing people into zones of pain, right? There's actually, organizations create certain kinds of distress, or what we call suffering in compassion research, because they're challenging people, because they're pulling on them. They're creating, kind of stressors as they create stretch goals. When we ask people to change and endure the uncertainty of change, that creates along with it a certain form of distress. And the best leaders and the best organizations that do that kind of change really well, or meet those kinds of extraordinary demands, have a way of handling that pain. Right? They have a way of systemically creating compassion for the pain that the system itself is generating.
Wow. So I'm putting myself in the shoes of some of the folks that I used to work with in this global Fortune 500 company. And I'm imagining them hearing this and all this talk of Aristotelian virtues and
yes, very academic and out there.
Yeah, doesn't something like compassion, isn't that really just kind of touchy-feely that belongs in maybe counseling and religion rather than at work?
Yeah. Well, let's kind of make it real for people in two ways. So the first way that I think we can make it more real for people in the business world is to review the evidence about, if you do this seemingly touchy-feely thing called compassion, does it matter to something that you care about as a part of running a great organization?
Yeah.
And that's what we did when we were writing this book, is that we really took stock of the current evidence that exists, not just our own research, but across the different fields that touch on organizational research. And we found very solid evidence that if you want to run an organization that's highly innovative, there are two mechanisms by which compassion helps make a capability for innovation stronger. Right. One is that it inspires people. When people are looking for how to solve problems and they can connect those problems to human pain and suffering in the world, they're much more motivated to solve them. That's your purpose-driven leader right there.
Right.
The second is that when organizations have more capability for compassion, they embrace mistakes in a more forgiving manner, and they sort of hold the pain of failure with sensitivity. And whenever you're asking people to innovate, you're also asking them to fail. Right? In lots of innovation spaces, we tell people to fail fast, right? Because we know that failure is part of learning. But what you can forget pretty easily in the motto, fail fast, is that failing hurts. Right? For high-performing people that are used to success, even if they know that failure is inevitable, it hurts like hell. So having your colleagues understand that it's painful, acknowledge the pain, acknowledge like there's learning and growth, but also, I just acknowledge that really hurts. That actually makes more of an environment where people recover faster. They're more likely to be more creative. They're more willing to make more mistakes or endure more failures. So in terms of innovation, there's lots of evidence that says your organization will have greater innovation capability with more compassion. We also have similar kinds of evidence for service quality, for collaboration. If your product or service really hinges on collaborative expertise, like surgical teams or airlines, for instance, you get significantly higher performance from collaborative teams that have more compassion in them, and that's measurable in all kinds of ways. The other thing that's very striking for business people is that there is quantitative evidence about how organizations recover from financial downturns and return to profitability. And those where their employees say the organization is more compassionate recover faster.
Wow.
So there's even a bottom line set of evidence about why it really matters for businesses.
Okay. Well, I want to ask you more about the evidence and how you collected that evidence. But first, I want to explore this idea of the pain of failure. I used to work for somebody who got really sold on this idea of failure is an important part of the innovation process. And so he wrote failure into everyone's review goals for the year. Said, okay, so when we do your performance review this time next year, I want you to have 2 significant failures. And if you don't, you're going to get called on it.
Yeah.
So what about that kind of approach? It doesn't sound very compassionate, but
how did it work?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't really remember. I think I may have not been part of the organization when that year rolled around.
I think that so to help people recognize that failure is a part of the expectations could be a compassion move as a manager. Okay. But also, I think stopping there might be really hard for people. So, we don't want to stop. If we're high achieving people and we want to be successful in our careers, we want our organizations to succeed. We don't want to stop in the failure part of the cycle, right? We want to move to the resilience part of the cycle. We want to have a way of using the failure to get to the next thing. And so I think that a way of maybe infusing a little bit more compassion into that kind of a performance review would be to say, well, part of what you're going to be measured on is, can you articulate 2 failures, but also why they mattered to our big goal, right, to our big objective, and what you learned from them, and how you and your coworkers are working differently now based on what you learned from those failures. So it's sort of that's a compassionate way of holding that there will be failure and pain, but linking it to purpose, and also saying, like, how is it changing your relationships? And are your relationships getting better even though your work is failing? And that would ensure that kind of emotional support and social support and all that fuzzy stuff that we talk about in relation to compassion is helping people actually learn and grow from the failure.
Okay, so that sounds like it's not only more compassionate, but also more accountable and more focused on learning and improvement.
Exactly. And that's why once you get underneath the hood of the word compassion and you start to really get what we mean by that and how it might take form in an organization, you can see that actually the goals of the organization and the goals of compassion can go hand in glove. They're not really separate from each other. It's in that kind of a case, you're actually only going to get to your best performance if you have compassion to lift people there.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And as I promised, I want to get back to that question of how you collected this evidence. You kept saying this was evidence-based, but tell me more about how did you measure the impact of something like compassion?
Well, okay, so I'm an organizational psychologist by training, and I have appointments in 2 different research institutes. So part of what I'm tasked with and measured on is, can I stay grounded in the research evidence, and can I design protocols to test my hypotheses? So this book, Awakening Compassion at Work, is actually based in a 20-year-long research program that a number of us who call ourselves the Compassion Lab have been engaged in. And in terms of measuring the business case, or the outcomes of compassion, we as the Compassion Lab have done it in a number of ways, including quantitative survey distribution inside an organization, and looking at inside one organization how compassion works